Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. Glad you're back for another training session. As Ed said, this is how xLights sees all models as a matrix, which not a great title for it, but basically trying to tell you how xLights sees things internally as opposed to what you're seeing on the screen for a little bit of breakdown of what your default model looks like to xLights. So going to get a little bit more technical than I think some of the other presentations have done, but it's kind of needed for some of this. Now, I said how xLights sees all models as a matrix, but some of those matrices are only a single line matrix. Other lines are multi-line matrices. Some of them are fully packed, and then some of them are only partially filled, especially in your custom models. So I'm going to go into a little bit of all of that, touch on submodels and groups, probably submodels a little bit more than groups, and a little bit of custom models, and custom models go hand in hand with your submodels. So that's just the quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. This isn't a matrix and how to model and what effects are going to look good on it type class. This is how all models are viewed, not just a matrix. Internally, though, xLights sees it as a matrix. A few things I just want to mention before we get into this. I am not an xLight developer. I don't read or write the code. So when I say xLights does these things, this is my understanding of what xLights does based on previous presentations I've heard playing around with xLights. Just different people saying different things over time and how I think it works. I'm probably going to say something that's wrong about what xLights does internally, and I'm sorry to the developers if I'm saying any of that stuff. I don't mean to sound like I know what it's doing or that I know how it could be changed or what it's doing. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not one of those. If you have a question on how that works, you're better off talking to one of those guys. If there's a bug in it, definitely don't tell me about that because I'm not going to be able to do anything to fix that. You can tell me about it, but it's not going to get fixed. I'm also going to let you know that I have not used a matrix or a megatree in my display. Yeah, I plan to. I always plan to. I've done sequences with them. I've just never actually got around to building one and setting it up in my yard. Another thing is, as I mentioned, this is a little bit more of an advanced topic than we've had in the past several weeks. It's somewhere between a beginner and a really advanced topic. It's an intermediate type topic. If this is the first video that you're watching, you may be a little bit confused. I tried to get it simple enough so that everybody can understand, but I'm not going to walk through and tell you how to set up a model and how to do universes and start channels and all that. So it assumes that you know a little bit more about xLights than a pure beginner. But even if you are a pure beginner, there's a lot of good points that you're going to be able to take away from this. So don't feel like you have to stop watching this. And it's being recorded, so you can always watch it again in the future. And keep in mind, too, that there are many ways to do the same thing. I'm not here to tell you what you're doing is wrong or that you're not doing things the way you should be. There's a few things that I'm going to say this might be a better way for you to do it, but there's many ways of doing it. Even as I'm going through a lot of the models, you'll see there's 2 or 3 different ways of doing the same thing, and some of them will give you exact same results. Some of them will just give you different ways you can render things and that show up. The point is basically to teach you something that you might not know how to do or another way to do it, so you have more options. The more options you have in xLights, the more you can do with it. So we're talking about matrices. You got to have the typical matrix thing. Take the blue pill, and basically you're going to disappear. You're not going to be in this training anymore, and it was nice to know you. Take the red pill, and we're going to get a little bit farther into all of this, have a little bit more fun, and see where this all goes. I apologize in advance again if I'm going to confuse anybody or say anything wrong. One other thing I will point out, and Ed was posting this earlier, is when I get into xLights for some of this training, I'm actually have already posted the xLights files that you'll need to follow along with this. So when I jump in and out of xLights, you don't have to try to recreate this all yourself. Just download the file. If you go to xlights.org on the resources page, the Google Shared Drive link is there. Go to free sequences, and it's the xLight tutorial with today's date on there. If you download that file, unzip it, just like you would any other shared sequence, it's got all of the elements that I'll be using for this training. So you can recreate anything I'm talking about here very quickly, very easily, see how playing around with some of them changes things, and see what I'm doing with all of this. I figured that'd be useful to everybody, especially for those who aren't able to do this hands-on or might not be able, only have a single screen, so you can't watch it and play with xLights at the same time. So the big thing here with all of this is that the different render styles. There are several different render styles that you can use to see how your models and effects will preview on your screen. The default render style is what xLights sees internally. That's basically your node layout, what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. That is not what you see on the screen as far as your node layout. Your per preview render style is what you see on the screen, or the preview of it. That will give you sometimes the same results, but many times very different results, because not everything you're going to do is a matrix. If everything was a matrix, both of them give you the same thing. But if you start getting into things like circles, stars, megatrees, those are going to look very different in your node layout and your per preview render style. So you'll notice as you go, or as I'm going through this, some of them I'll be changing back and forth. That's to show you the difference. But my main focus of the presentation is to show you what the default render style does, because I think a lot of people are confused about what that does. In past presentations, there's been a lot of questions on how do I do this? How can I do that? And those questions are what led me to this presentation, and filling in for where we had a hole is based on previous questions. So thanks to everybody who have asked those in the past. So the first thing I'm going to talk a lot about is a single line model. And this could be a number of different things, but the easiest is just a single line. It's one row, as you can see here. I think you can see my mouse. One row that goes across and multiple columns. If you right click on this particular model and bring up your node layout, you'll see that the preview model with all your little nodes looks just like the node layout down here at the bottom. One row tall, multiple columns. In this case, I've got 50 nodes. It's got 50 nodes. And that's as simple as it gets. You're going from one side to the other with one row. You'll notice on this that there is no height to it, which means any of your effects that you were to drop on this that have height really aren't going to do anything. Only things that go left and right are really going to have any distinguishable pattern. Other things might generate different color lights on there. It might look kind of good, but it's not going to look like what the name of it is. Keep in mind, too, that a single line model is not just limited to your single lines. Polylines and arches pretty much are the same thing. Circles and candy canes, when you only have one circle or one candy cane, are essentially single line models. It's just how they're displayed on the screen that's slightly different. Internally to xLights, they look the same to it. It's how they're showed on your screen that's different. And as I mentioned, only a single row is used on these. You're primarily using only left and right effect directions with your default render model. If you change it to per preview, all that goes out the window. In a couple of cases, like the candy cane, that's actually up and down versus left and right, but I'll show that to you when we get a little bit farther in here. But same concept. Now, what I'm showing here is 3 different single line models, even though on your screen they're going to look a little bit different. The top one is a pure single line model. It's displaying as a single line model, as you can see on the right of that. If you bring up the node layout, starts on the left-hand side with node 1, increases to the right-hand side, it would go all the way up to node 50. Only 1 through 10 are shown here. The next model down is an arch. You'll notice that the node numbers for that are exactly the same as the single line model up above. Same with the circle down at the bottom. The node numbers start at 1, go up to 10. They'd continue on to 50 if I showed that all. But there's only one row. That's all there is on here. That's all it's going to see in xLights. xLights sees them as the same exact thing. The only thing that's different is up at the top where it says display as. One's displaying as a single line, the other's as an arch, the other is as a circle. That's only for your benefit, being able to sequence and what it looks like. xLights really doesn't care in the default model which one of those it is. It treats them all the same. They all do the same thing as far as that's concerned. And the way you can think of this is when you're going from the top model down to the bottom, it's just like actually creating your arch. You take a flat piece of pipe that would be your single line model, you bend it, you create this arch type model. If you were to keep bending that and close it, you get the closed circle down at the bottom. xLights sees it as the same thing. It's just treating everything as that straight pipe. It's not treating things with the curve unless you tell it to look at it a little bit differently. But by default, it is not looking at those any differently than a single line. One little tangent I'm going to make on here is I would recommend that you always, always, always put the green dot on the left. That is not necessarily obvious to everybody, but it can make a huge difference, especially if you're sharing sequences, purchasing sequences, downloading sequences. It can make a big deal. If everybody's consistent and puts it on the left, you're going to get similar results. If you start putting it on the right, it's going to mess you up a little bit. Now, that's not to say that you have to always put your starting location at the left or the green dot. The green dot would go on the left. If you're telling your starting location is at the green square, or the green dot as I've been calling it, it just means that your first node, your lowest node on that particular screen, is on the green side. Your highest node, which in this case is 50, is on the right-hand side on the blue square. If you reverse that and decide to put your starting location at the blue square, the numbers are simply reversed. You're putting your lowest node, which likely is connected to your controller, on the blue dot side, and your highest number on the green dot side. This would be for the case when you have it connected on the right-hand side of your controller. If you reverse this, xLights doesn't know that the green dot, if you were to draw it the opposite way on the right-hand side, xLights doesn't know that the green dot can be on the right-hand side. xLights always takes the green on the left-hand side. And I'll show you an example of that when we get into xLights and how that can really be kind of goofy and give you unexpected results. But I would recommend always, always, always put that on the left-hand side. Because when you click on your node layout, for any of these particular ones on here, the green dot is going to be on the left-hand side of your node layout. Any one of these you'd click on, it'd give you the exact same thing. The ones up here where I have it on the right-hand side, even though the green dot's over here, xLights sees that node over here. I'd also say, personal preference, I like to keep the green dot at the bottom as opposed to up at the top. You can do it top to bottom, either way, but I would say be consistent. Always have that green dot in the same location or pure vertical. But if you're going up a ridge of your house and the green dot is at the bottom and the right-hand side, I find that a little bit more confusing. I'd always say do it like the left-hand side over here, where your green dot is always more to the left than your blue dot. That's my recommendation, just to keep things simple. If everybody's consistent, it works out well. Like I said, if you're not consistent, it's a little bit confusing. So let's actually see this in action in xLights, which is what we all want to play with. I've got those exact same models in here, and if you were to download that sequence that I pointed out earlier, you'll see this exact same thing. On here, I've got several different previews. First preview we're going to talk about is single lines. There is one sequence in there that I'll go through that shows you how to do everything. And as I mentioned before, if you click on here, go to your node layout, you'll see your number 1 starts at, because I have it up at the green dot. Green dot is your lowest number, goes from 1 to 50. Same thing with your arch, same exact thing. Circle would give you, again, same thing. The only thing that's different on these is this little part here where it says the circle. This is just how it's shown visually to you. Everything else is the same. Even your candy cane is very similar. Now this one, instead of being one row and multiple columns, is one column starting at the bottom going up to the top. But all this is that same pipe that we had before. Instead of just bent into a full arch, only part of it's bent into an arch. Once you start getting into multi-candy canes, it's a little bit different and a little bit confusing. And over here, I've got another element that I've called just a single line. This has a slight angle to it where I'm going to kind of show how different things can look. This isn't pure vertical. It's got a little bit of an angle, and I'll show you when you mess around with things, how that can have an impact. The other thing to note, as I said, when you click on the node layout, the green, or your green dot is this side all the time. Even if I take that, move that over here, and click on it again, this is still node 1. This is my green dot according to xLights, even though my green dot is over here. It doesn't know where in the circle you are when you're doing this. So I'm just going to save that again real quick, not re-render. I'm going to jump into the sequence. If you're following along and you have downloaded this, you'll see I have many groups in here just to keep things easily organized for myself. This isn't necessarily a recommendation of how you should sequence or do anything. This is just for that tutorial, so I'm able to see different things quickly. So for this particular model, I'm just putting, it's a single line, 50 nodes starting at the green dot that was on my left-hand side. The effect is a bars moving to the right. Simple enough, very straightforward. It's acting just like I would think it would, just like you would expect it to act, no matter whether I'm using the default model over here or the, the per preview one is the third effect here. When I switch to the up model, you'll notice all of the colors are the same. That's because it's going row by row instead of column by column. Everything in that particular row is moving up, changing color, cycling through the colors that I have checked here. And this is going back, like I said, to the right. We're going per preview. In this particular case, because it's a completely horizontal line and it's just a single line model, per preview and the default model are exactly the same. As I mentioned before, if you put something like a butterfly on this, it is going to change the colors, but this really doesn't look like a butterfly effect. If you were to put that on a matrix, it just looks like a bunch of lights kind of randomly blinking. Same thing with something like the circles effect. You can put it on here, but none of this really looks like circles. These are nodes coming across the front gutter or something, not necessarily circles like you'd see on a matrix. We can put text on a single line too, but unless you're trying to type in Morse code, this really doesn't make a lot of sense to anybody. You need height to be able to do your butterfly, your circles. Most of the effects that you have in xLights really need some height to them. There are a fair number of them, probably 5 or 6 elements that look good on a straight line, a single line. The rest of them aren't really cut out for that. So now, when I had my single line here with the first effect going to the right-hand side, it starts at the one side, goes to the other. I'm going to put that same effect onto an arch, and it's doing the same type of effect that you were seeing before. Starts on the left, goes to the right. All of them are very equal because I'm doing it by the default model. If I go up and down, or I'm sorry, if I change to the per preview model, you'll notice that the ends of the arch have a lot more lights than the center of the arch. That's because instead of looking at this as an equal number of nodes on a straight pipe, it's turned this into a grid that's got a certain height and a certain width because it's based on a per preview model. And what happens there is you have more lights. I'll try to stop it at a good point here. It's dividing this third where the red is and the blue and the green into the same based on the distance between these in its model. It's tough to see in the model preview. It's a little bit more exaggerated over here in the house preview. That these are actual equally distant. Not equal number of nodes like it would be in a straight line, but equal distances based on the arching effect. When you're down here and it's very straight up, you can get a lot more nodes in a similar distance. When you get towards the center, a lot fewer nodes because they're spaced farther apart. It can be a little confusing to understand that, but once you get the hang of this being seen as a straight line, not an arch, in your default model, it makes quite a bit of sense. And that, hopefully as I go on, that'll make a lot more sense when we see this on some other models. Again, if I were to change this to a per preview up effect, it's doing the same thing. It's coming up both sides of it, going up the model based on what you're seeing on the screen. It's moving in the up direction. But if I change this to the default model, it's treating it just like it did with the single line. It's only one row. It's changing the colors as they're moving up the model. So the entire row does the same thing as you go along it. Exact same thing with a circle. It's spinning around because it thinks this is just one line starting, I believe, at the bottom, spinning around, coming to the other side. So it's just going to keep spinning around and around like that. This is not any fancy pinwheel effect or fan effect or anything like that. This is simply a bars effect that's moving right to left, or moving to the right direction in the default render style, because I'm taking this as a straight line as xLights sees it. If I were to change that to a per preview, then I'm shooting out one side, going across to the other, and coming around, finishing up the circle. It's not really spinning, it's just going from one side to the other. If I change it up, does something very similar. And if I change that again to a default model going up, the entire circle changes. Again, it's just like the single line over here where it was going in the up direction. This effect here was copied over to here. Gives you the exact same results, just a different image on the screen. Candy cane, same thing, except now when I'm going to the right, because this is a pure horizontal model, as I showed you in xLights, this is where they're all changing to the same color because it's treating it as one column when it's moving right to left. If I change that to the per preview over here, it comes along, but this isn't really an effect anybody's going to really want with the entire base of the candy cane one color and then just shooting up and over along the top. If we change that from instead to right on the per preview to up on the per preview, it gets a little bit closer. We're changing up here, but it's no longer going along the candy cane to the end. It's coming up both sides. Again, because we're using the per preview model, not the default model where it's going from one end to the other. The last one here is what we want. I'm going up the column, default model. The default model doesn't see this bend. It just takes it as one line. You're going all the way up and off the screen in this particular case, but it gives you it going to the end because that's what my the way it's drawn and looks. If you, again, visualize this as just a single line in your mind, that's what the computer is doing, that's what xLights is doing, but when you see it in your real model curving around like that, looks very nice and you can do a lot of nice things. I'm using bars effects on most of these because it was easier to see on the screen, but you can do morphs on this, you can do your single line effects on this, curtains, some chases look really good on this too. Again, this is just a tutorial, I can't cover everything with it, just trying to give you some of the basics. Now I said you got that single line model that I had over here, you can see on the house preview on the right hand side, that it looks pretty good. When it's on the default model, it's doing what I want. It's got 3 different colors, they're equally spaced. You'll notice on the model preview on the left-hand side, it's going in a different direction than the house preview that's going up here. That's because your model preview is taking it just like your node layout would look. It doesn't know which orientation you have this at. It doesn't care. It's looking at it as one column. This is your left-hand side, your green dot side, moving over to the right-hand side. If you change that particular effect from the default style to your per preview, now it's looking at it with this orientation it has up here. And now you see it, it gets a lot more jumpy and a lot less good looking in my opinion. The closer you have that to vertical, the worse it ends up getting, and I'll show you that as I move it there. Not quite vertical, but I'm very close, and you do need to click off the effect and then back on to see the change. Now this is not quite vertical, you can see it's probably about halfway, and it's just jumping one color to the other color, not really an effect I'm going for. The reason that I'm bringing this up, and it was kind of nice that I believe it was Steven was kind of showing his model at the beginning of this. He had a lot of columns that Robert was helping him get the orientation right. He had the green dot at the top, no big deal. It was consistent throughout, so it's not a problem. But a lot of those lines were not truly vertical. If you try putting a per preview effect on those, because they're not drawn all in the same orientation, you might get some odd effects like this on there. So when you're doing modeling your house and that, don't necessarily follow the picture of your house if you're not straight onto it. Do what your lights are actually, or what you're trying to actually do with your lights. If you think those are all truly vertical, draw them truly vertical, even if they don't line up perfectly. Your other option is to go with your default render style, so no matter how you have them oriented, they're going to be going up and down or left and right, depending on what you're doing it. The other thing to point out with here is I put my green dot at the bottom, and that is considered the left-hand side of my model. So when I put a right effect on it, it's going from what would be my green dot to my blue dot, which is in the right direction. I always put my green dot at the bottom so I know this is right, even though it's technically looks like it's going in the up direction here. If I were to change this to the up direction, it's just going to cycle through the lines because it's only one row high, and that's all it cares about. So you got to remember where your green dot is when you're doing this on the default model isn't necessarily where your green dot actually is. It's on a row, not a column. I'm going to jump to the next one where that gets a little more into that now, with a little bit of lines and arches, and show you a couple of the differences there. On this particular model, single line on the top, I have it, and I won't click on that yet. I've got it starting at the green square. My green square is on the left-hand side. This is purely vertical, and I have it locked, so this is a red dot, but ordinarily would be a blue dot. The next model down is the same thing. Oh, this one's starting at the green square. This one should actually have been the blue square. The next one down, I did reversed. I put the green square on the right-hand side. Again, I normally wouldn't do this, but this is for the tutorial to show you what's going on. And the next one down here, I'm going to put starting at the blue square. So I've got it, the top two are drawn properly. The bottom two aren't the way I would recommend doing it, but they alternate. Green square start, blue square, green square, blue square. Same with the arches, very similar. When you're drawing an arch, it automatically is going to put the green square on the left-hand side, so you don't need to think about it. You can start this at either your green square or your blue square. Again, this is locked, so it's showing up red. This one's starting at the blue square, this one's starting at the green square. These arches over here are not that easy to create. When xLights draws it, and I'll just put an arch in here, when you draw an arch in xLights, it automatically wants to go that way. If you draw it in the opposite direction, it turns it upside down. Well, you can manipulate it, swing it around like this, and kind of make it look like that to force your green square on the wrong side, which is kind of what down here is showing. I just included that for fun. But I would consider these couple of models over here backwards models, kind of like these bottom two lines over here. And I'll show you why that matters now. Let me just click save there. Going to jump back into the sequencer, and I had a feeling that was going to happen. A couple of these do tend to crash when making some of the changes, so let me just bring that back up. I don't know if that's a bug or just a misuse of xLights, so I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. Okay, again, we're on this screen here that's showing the lines and the arches. We come over here. I'm going to change my house preview. I right-clicked on that, and I'm going to bring up my lines and arches models. You can see them there. This is the same bars effect that I was using on my previous demonstration, going in the right direction, default model. First model, green dot would be on the left, and it's the starting locations there. I copy this down to the next location, exact same effect, it does the exact same thing on the next model down. I go to the next one, all of a sudden you notice it's going in the opposite direction. Why is that? That's because the green dot is drawn on the wrong hand side. The green dot internally to xLights is always on the left. So it's on the left, it's moving to what it thinks is the right, because I drew this 180 degrees from where xLights thinks it is. You'll get really confused because the model preview shows it going in the correct direction. The house preview shows it opposite that. It's because the model preview, no matter what orientation of the line, is going to show this single line as a horizontal model moving from right to left. You just drew this upside down. This is why I recommend you always put that green dot on the left-hand side and use it that way. It doesn't matter. These two models just had different starting locations. That doesn't play in at all. And I'll put all of these together. All of these are the exact same effect that are on something that's slightly different. If you start drawing things incorrectly, putting the same things on here, you'll get very different effects, and that confuses a lot of people. You'll notice I also have these in a group. If I put it on a group with a default, these all look like they're moving in the correct direction. I go over here, I change it to per preview, they still look like they're all working in the same direction. If I go over here to this one, and now I change it to a vertical stack, all of a sudden they've gone in a different direction. That's how some of this can be very confusing to people, especially new people who are downloading sequences, shared, purchased, however they get them. If whoever you're getting them from isn't being consistent with the way they're drawing things, or you're not being consistent with the way they were drawing things, you'll get things like this showing up. Some of it might be good and look really fine. You might like it and leave it like that. But if you're trying to get a particular effect and it's just looking awful, that could be part of your problem. Not saying it is, it just could be. Same thing with arches. Arches and single lines are essentially the same thing. You can see here, this one was drawn right, going from right to left. Doing the exact same thing here. This one's going in the opposite direction. Same here, same general concept here, just showing it working on arches because arches act just like lines. Same thing when you put them into a group, the group's going correctly when we're doing it as a default. When we're doing it as a per preview, we change it over to a vertical stack render style, and all of a sudden you see them going in the opposite direction. That might be your intent, that might not be your intent. It's really up to you. There's no easy way of determining what that is going to be. Going to jump into a little bit more of the meat of things here. With matrices, because this is really what confuses a lot of people on here, and it's actually a relatively simple concept once you start to think about it. I wanted to talk about single lines first so you can get the general concept and then move on. But a matrix here, multiple lines, multiple rows. In this case, I'm starting at the bottom left, and I'm going over node 1 on string 1 is going from the bottom over, just like it's laid out here. Nice. Come up to the second line, your second row is string 2, nodes 1 and over, all the way up to 16. Fills out your matrix completely. If you were to look at this on the screen, it looks just like this, just with numbers filled out. Nice full matrix, easy to understand what's going on. But not only are your matrix models going to have that node layout, your megatrees, your spinners, if you have multiple circles or multiple candy canes, they're going to give you very similar type things. The effects generated on all of those different types of models are going to be exactly the same. It's just how they're displayed on the screen. Just like a single line can be displayed as an arch or a circle or a candy cane, very similar type things can be done with matrices, except you have even more options with matrices because they don't always have to be full. A single line that's missing a few columns really just has a gap in it. When you get into a matrix missing multiple lines, then it gets into custom models and a lot of different things. Matrices can pretty much use almost all of the effects. There's a few exceptions like your servos, your DMX type effects. Those really wouldn't apply to it, but most of your other effects this will apply to. And these will give you very, very different results based on your render style. If you use the default render style, it may give you the same thing as your per preview, but it may give you something drastically different. And that's where a lot of the power of xLights comes in, is you can change those render styles and get very different effects to generate. I'm here to tell you what the default's going to do for the most part and how you can kind of visualize that in your head, what's going on. Now here I have 6 different models shown. All 6 of these models, if you were to create them, and I'll show you that in xLights, how I've created them, click on the node layout for all of them. The node layout for all of these is identical. If I did not tell you, if I only showed you the node layout, not what it was being displayed as, you would have no way of telling one of these from another, unless you were to somehow hack the code and know what's going on. But all of these have 16 strings, 16 columns. They're 15 nodes high, or 50 nodes high. And I use that just because that's what xLights used as a default. But this one, the matrix over here is 16 columns. This is a flat tree. Basically, all it's doing is it's smushing the top of them together, pulling the bottom out a little bit farther. Same basic concept, it just looks slightly different. Here I'm getting into 180-degree megatree. It looks just like this one, except I've kind of given it a little bit of shape so it kind of mimics 3D. xLights doesn't do anything in pure 3D. It just draws it so it looks like it's in 3D to your eye. xLights doesn't know this has any depth whatsoever. It just knows things that are closer to you are going to be spaced farther apart. Things that are farther are going to get a little closer together. This would be true no matter what angle I put on this tree. I used 180 for this presentation because 360 gets tough to see, especially if you're looking at a smaller screen. But it's an identical type situation. Over here, this is a spinner with a 90-degree angle. That looks somewhere in between these 2 megatrees. It's the same general concept. The top of the tree, in this case, would be the center of the circle. Same number of prongs sticking out. This is the bottom of the tree, spread out like that. You change that to 180, it looks like this. You change that to 360, it's your typical type spinner. Again, all of these, xLights sees is the exact same thing. It doesn't know there's any difference. It's only us seeing something different that really causes some of the confusion. If you were to put any different effects on these, as I'll show you in a minute, they're going to react pretty much the same. You just need to realize where the different parts of that are. So as I said before, this is 16 strings I've got going across. I went up to 50 tall on each of these. Just like with the green dot being on the left-hand side, your top of your matrix, whether it be a matrix or a tree or even a custom model, where this little line comes up from it and that blue dot is, that is where it thinks the top of your model is. When you put your starting location here of where you're injecting your first string of lights or whatever, not injecting, but attaching it to the controller and saying the bottom left is based on this being the top location. So I'm saying I'm going to start down here in this corner. If I were to rotate this 90 degrees, this bottom left rotates over to here and is looking like it's the bottom right. But you don't base it on that. You base it on where the top is. Once you start rotating this and start changing directions, it's just like putting the green dot on the wrong side. It will really change how your preview is going to look if you're using the default style. So let's go back into xLights and see some of this in action. I'm going to jump back into here, change over to preview 3 that's showing just matrices at first. I've got several different matrices here. Again, these aren't for a real show. These are just to show you some differences. All of these are 60 strings, 50, just like I was showing you before. If you go to the node layout, there is exactly what I showed you in the presentation. The only difference on this is this one here is going to be at the top left start. This one's a top right start, bottom left, bottom right. For these, it will show you slightly different results on your node layout. Here I'm starting at the top left, so node 1's up here. Here I'm starting at the bottom left, so node 1's at the bottom. So these are slightly different in that respect. But when you put an effect on them, the effect doesn't matter where your start node and end node is. It's going to generate the effects the same. So these are 4 different ones. This one here, I've put the this upside down. I'll actually give it a little bit of an angle so you can show how that's seeing on the per preview and that it's not really what we're expecting. But if you look at the node layout, It's still going to generate it like this. It doesn't see that rotation for any of it. These ones over here are very similar to these over here, except I have put all of the channels to be starting at the same location, but different start locations. Again, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, just to show you that if you put it on one, it can generate a mirrored image on the others. Not usually what you'd want to do, but sometimes you can do. So I'm going to close my arch groups here and single lines. I'm going to jump over to my test matrix group. Again, I did the groups for simplicity for this presentation, not something you'd necessarily want to do on a real sequence. You could. So I'm going to go to my test matrix here. I just picked one. I need to change this preview to my matrices. The panel that I showed at an angle, the panel over here, had the same start channel. The one over here is running to the right, just like I'd expect it to on my default render style with a bars effect. This one over here is running in some different awkward direction. That's based on this being at the top. This is the top. This is going in the right direction as you would expect. It's just when you're looking at it on the screen, it's not what you would expect because that point wasn't the top of your matrix. A lot of times you can't put these, with a pure matrix, most people have those pure up and down. When you get into other models, stars, snowflakes, any type of custom model, and you rotate things, you may not be able to put your top right at the top. But when you're rendering an effect, that's where you need to know where that is to determine whether you want to render it as your default style or if you want to do it on a per preview style. And if I were to take this, remove that effect and put it on matrix 9, here you'll see it's doing the exact same thing. Even though this is the rotated matrix that I put the effect on, it's still going in that right-left direction because it's on default. If I change it to per preview, now it's going pure to the right as you would expect it to be doing because it's based on your per preview. But you might not want it to go that way. You might want it to go some other way. It just depends on what the rotation is, where you figure that out, where that's going. Sometimes what's fun is these two models have the exact same channel counts. I've got overlapping channels. I did that intentionally to show you the difference. I'm getting a very different effect over here based on it rendering over here. If you want to create a ghost model to get different things, you'll hear that term called out sometimes, ghost models. It's creating a model that's not actually going to be in your show. You're just putting an effect on it to render something differently on something that's actually in your show. I'll show a few more of those as we move a little bit through this. Here's just showing a butterfly effect on that same type of panel. Now I'm going to show you, even though I had the different start locations on all of these panels, all of these are the exact same effect copied down. They're all doing the exact same thing. It doesn't matter where your start channel is as long as the top of your matrix is in the same location. Same thing with the butterfly, doing the exact same thing on all 4 of these panels. I go over to my matrix over here that all of these had the same start channels, but I was putting my start location in a different thing. If you're using overlapping channels, doing ghosting models or something along those lines, this is where it matters. This one, the bottom left corner is here. This is mirrored along this line here. These 2 panels over here are mirrored along this line. I included this just for a little bit of fun. You probably wouldn't want to come across that in there, but it shows you that your start location does matter if you're overlapping your channels. Going to jump into the trees now. Here, and I'll jump back into my layout screen. This was just like I showed you in xLights. All of these have the exact same node layout. I started all of these at the bottom left, 16 strands of 50, bottom left starting location. Like I said, you wouldn't know the difference of any of these if I just gave you this node layout, not told you what the display is on here. They're all the same. It's only how they're displayed that's slightly different. This one over here, or these 2, are actually slightly different than that. These are a custom model. I exported this custom model, and then I imported it in as this. If I go into this, it no longer sees that nice little matrix. It sees a much bigger matrix with only certain points filled in. If you look in this matrix, look carefully, it's missing some nodes. That's because as we get up near the top, some of these overlapped, so some of these got overwritten and only one was brought in on that. This last matrix, I went in and I corrected that. I also went in and I added some submodels. I added 2 different submodels in here. One is the strings, where I just labeled them from 1 to 50. I knew I had 16 strings, each of 50. I filled that all out. I did a second submodel that was the exact same thing, where I clicked the vertical buffer layout. I'll get into that a little bit more as I go on through this, but when I'm showing you the effects, you can see how that goes. I'm also going to jump a little bit ahead here, show you the spinners. Same thing as I had on that other preview. These ones I won't get into too much, but basically these were showing different start locations for the same thing, and just how the, with the lines and the matrices, how that different start locations really doesn't matter with your effects. Trees and spinners, all of these, basically these first 3 and the 3 at the bottom were the ones I showed in the other things, that they do the same thing. The 2 trees over here, this is my custom that's missing a few dots. This is my custom that I filled in and put some effects on, put some submodels on. I'm going to jump back into the sequencer. I'm going to go onto my trees here. This is just a bars effect moving to the right. You'll notice that all of these, they're using overlapping channels, again, done intentionally to show you how the same effect is looking on all of these different things. I put this on a matrix. It's going strand by strand from one side to the other, lighting it up. That's what I'd want on a tree. That's what I'd want on a flat tree, on a mega tree like this, even on a custom model, it's showing upright. If I take that same effect and copy it over and put it on my flat tree as opposed to my matrix, it gives the exact same result. Why is that? xLights sees it as the exact same thing. It doesn't know the difference of what this is looking like. It only knows the difference if I change it from the default model to the per preview. Now all of a sudden my matrix looks a lot different than this, because this is trying to draw a straight line across them and generates a slightly different effect. Most people aren't going to want something that looks like this on a flat tree or a mega tree. You want it to render on the per preview. This looks much more like we're expecting on that. So that's why you need to know what your per preview is looking like, and why this model that's going from right to left is just going right to left string by string when it's doing it. Again, I copy this down onto my round tree for my flat tree, same thing. I copy this down on my custom model that has the missing nodes here. Not only does it look bad in general, but you can see that it's got this chunk of black nodes on the full matrix. That's an indication that I was missing some on here. So this model is pretty much garbage, kind of ignore that. I'll jump down to the next model where I filled that all in. And you'll see, we're not getting black spaces on the others, but we're still getting this effect that's going from one side to the other. That's because it doesn't have, when you do a custom model, you don't have a difference between a per preview model and a default model, because it's built a big matrix in xLights. It doesn't know strand by strand. That's where you have to go in and do your submodels in order to create that. When I first did it, I told you I did the strings and I didn't have that vertical buffer checked. When I put it on there, even though this is the same effect, going to the right, default, I copy it down to here, it puts those in a different order when it generates those. So it thinks that this is the left side, this is the right side, and my effect is moving up. I have to change that. I had to click that little buffer button to make it vertical in order to make it appear like the rest. You do have to watch that when you're creating submodels, how that's oriented. Again, I'll get into that a little bit more in a few more of the examples that I've got going on here. In a bit, I'll show you the same thing here. I'm just going to show it on your matrix if you put a butterfly effect. If you put it on your custom model with a default render style, looks decent on this tree, but you go over to your matrix and it looks like a bad painting where everything's, I think that's Picasso, but I'm not an artist, so I might be getting that wrong. If I put it on my vertical submodel, it starts to look a lot more like this. In fact, it's the exact same thing the way xLights is seeing it. Same thing with text. Text looks good here. Text looks good here. Text looks good there. You get into this bad model I had, it doesn't know what to do with the text because it can't lay it out properly. Same thing when I get to this. You need to get into something that has submodels so it knows where the strings are so you can generate them properly, because otherwise there's a bunch of holes. Again, this one was on just the strings model that was going in the incorrect version. This has it in the correct version. So a lot of this is how things are oriented. I'm going to skip over the spinners section here because it's not really needed. You can download it. You can take a look at that. It's pretty much trying to show similar type things. But as I said, all of these are basically seen the same as xLights. When I jump in and I put an effect here on my matrix, it's generating it from one side of my matrix to the other. The trees are going from one side to the other. My spinner's one side to the other. Same here. It's starting here, coming around. This one's starting here, coming around. These all have the same channels. They're all doing the same thing. If you didn't have that, they wouldn't be doing the same thing. Again, I'm trying to show you how it sees this from one side to the other. I can put this same effect on any one of these models that I have done properly, not this improper one, and you're going to see the exact same effect on here. It doesn't matter what it looks like. Why? Because xLights sees them all as the exact same thing. Now you might look at something like this tree spinner here and go, wait, this isn't moving from one side to the other. It's going around the bend. Again, in xLights, xLights sees it just like this model up here. It's going from one side to the other. It's just us visually that's seeing it going around the bend like this. It's not anything more than that. So when you're trying to do a fan type effect with this spinning around, I'll see a lot of people do fan type effects. I forget, fan and pinwheel on these, trying to get it to work. That won't work with your default render style. Those have to be a per preview render style. But there's no reason to mess around with all of that when you can just put a bars effect going from one side to the other and it'll generate it just fine. Up here, I've changed this to, instead of going from right to left, I put a down effect on here. You can see it's going down on all my tree type effects. This spinner, that's only a 90-degree spinner, it's coming down. When you go over to a 360-degree spinner, down isn't really down. Down is out from the center. Very easy to make a starburst type pattern, a firework type pattern using that type of thing when you're just thinking that the top of your model here is the same as your center model here, and it's doing the exact same thing. And this is where you can get into a lot more of your effects that do a lot more fun things. You put a shockwave in the middle of a matrix. Looks really good. Looks semi-good on a 90-degree spinner, even not so bad over here. You get into the 360 spinner, it's not quite doing what we're wanting. Why? Because that type of effect thinks that this location over here on the right center is the center of our matrix, and it's bursting out from there. That's not really what you want on that type of effect. You almost wanted something back like this, just with a few gaps. We put this same effect up here, down here, copied it over, gives us the exact same results, whether it's on a spinner or a matrix, because xLights sees them as the same thing. You have to change it to a per preview model to get that to go from the inside bursting to the outside. Again, very different results. Default model, per preview model. This is where the difference comes in, and this is what I'm hopefully explaining to some of you to understand why it's doing it the way it is. Same thing with a morph effect, spinning around. Matrix goes from one side to the other. A spinner, spinning around the arms for doing that. If you want it to go outside, you just can come into here, change your default render style, get rid of my effect assist window here. You may need to change your transformation depending on which way you want to go. This way it actually worked well, but you can show it's bursting to the outside. I didn't have to go in, do some crazy type adjustments to this to get it to do that. It's a symbol of render style, moving in the, morph, coming from one side to the other and working well. If I try to do this in a per preview, I can't get it to burst from the outside like that. It goes from the bottom up, top down. You can adjust that. You're much better off coming over to something like this, having your default render style, rotate it 90 or 180 if you want it to go in and out, and use it that way. Same thing over here. We'll get into the fan effects. Like I was talking about, looks really good on a matrix or a mega tree. You get down into here into a spinner, that's not what you want to see on a spinner with a fan. That effect really doesn't work well on there. no matter what your render style, per preview or clicking back here to default. It's not set up for that. If I wanted to make something spin like a little color wheel, again, looks really nice up here, not great over here. By the time you get over here, you don't know what it is. It doesn't look anything like that. On the mega tree, I copied that down, same effect over here. Come in here and I changed it to per preview. Now per preview looks a lot more like what I'd be looking at. 4 of the different things are generating 4 of the different things just like they would be over here. But I don't need to go into a pinwheel effect, mess with the sides, the twist, the thickness, and all that to get it right. I could simply do a bars effect, drop down here, and it's doing the exact same thing because I know each of these bars are like a strand in a mega tree that are acting one way or another. So this is the most useful one, I think. I hope I have explained that well in here, that it's basically seeing this side of the tree as a portion of the spinners, the top of the tree is the center of this, the bottom of the tree is the outside. You can change around which way things go fairly easily so that you can comprehend it, but that's the basics of it. I am running a little bit long here. If you'd like me to stop, I can. I do have some
No, you continue on. This is great.
Okay. Gonna jump back into the PowerPoint. Going to talk a little bit about submodels now, and this is, I think, where a lot of the confusion lies with people on how things are going. A submodel is simply a portion of an existing model. Here I'm showing a particular matrix, and the submodel I have generated is highlighted in the white dots here where I want it to just be the center portion of that. Why? I don't know. That's what was easiest to explain. I don't know if you'd really do this in any case, but it's on there. The thing you have to pay attention to is when you're creating a submodel and you put in nodes on these particular lines, it's going to light them up, but it has no idea about, or it's not telling you anything about the order that you're putting them in. The order that you put them in is very, very important to generate the effects like you want to see them. And I'll get into that as I'm going through here. This is just showing a full matrix with what I want my submatrix to be. My submatrix in this case, I'm going to start at node 121. I'm going to move to the right up to 140. I'm going to come over. I'm going to zigzag back. And I'm going to do that all the way up to node 280. For this particular model, that's just what I chose to use as an example. If I create a submodel and I say I want it to go from nodes 121 to 280, that covers all my nodes. All those white lines would light up just fine, like I showed back here. These would all be lit. It looks like it's great. But when I go and I would actually create an equivalent custom model or a ghost model, it's seeing this as line 1, that's the number of rows you have. Your line 1 is your bottom row. I only have one, so that's all it's taking. And all of the numbers that would go from here, 121 to 280, would be in individual columns. It's not 280 columns, it's 280 minus the 121, so it ends up being 160 because 121 is counted. Those all would go in a single line from one side to the other. xLights sees that as a single line model. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, there's not a whole lot you can do with a single line model. So creating that submodel really isn't going to do you a lot of good unless you just want to put a color on that. But if you want to put something like an effect on that that has some height or some text, this does you almost no good whatsoever. So here I'm showing your different node layouts. I basically generated a custom model. You can see here 121 to 140, I'm coming up, I'm looping around. Down here 121, I come over to 140. It's not looping it around to another row to look just like this. This being my original model with a submodel, down here being my custom model. A custom model that is mimicking my submodel. It comes over and it just keeps going, and that'll go on to 280. That's not what we want to get. We don't want that whatsoever. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to say, okay, let's try this a little bit differently. I need as many lines in my submodel, or as many rows in my submodels as I have in my real model. I know that's 8 of them. Again, when you're creating a submodel, line 1 is your bottom row. It's just the way it would work visually. it's not actually creating this custom model. This custom model is just what I'm creating to kind of show how the differences would be. It's not doing that. The order here is the same as the order on the bottom row. As you create more lines, it's moving up. So keep in mind, line 1 is at the bottom, line 8 is at the top, if you're trying to align the two. A little bit confusing, but understandable. Here, I just went, I know I have 20 nodes on each of these lines that I'm trying to do, node 121 to 140, jumping down to the next ones, and I'm going. Here, it's doing the exact same thing to mimic what I've done here. Now, I know that this is not right. xLights is not going to create this bottom box for you. You're not going to see it. All you're going to see is this box here. You have assigned it things. It's going to show all those little white nodes as being lit up in your model. But this is not actually what we want. We had them zigzagged. So if you look here, this nodes that I had, 121 coming over to 140, 141 up and zigzagging, is not the same here. This has got it going 140, then it comes back over here to come around. You have to pay attention to the order that it's going in. We actually want to have 8 lines. We want to have 121 to 140, 160 to 141. We want to make this zigzag back and forth so it's exactly matching what we have in xLights. Now, very rarely would you have to go in and create a submodel of a matrix, because there's a nice little tool in there for anything that's nice and square, rectangular, that'll do that for you. The reason I'm pointing this out is this is easy to see when you get into things like your snowflakes or your spinners or some other crazy custom models. That's where you want to know that this order is very, very important. If you just fill up all your nodes in this, it doesn't make any sense to xLights. It's basically creating from these lines a new model like this custom model, which is basically a new matrix that you've created that is named the submodel. You can't see it. You can't do anything to individual strands on that particular submodel, but you can put effects on that submodel. On the submodel only, nothing below when you get to submodels. So here you can see top and bottom, we have the exact same things. We know we've got that right. I'll show you that in xLights when we've got it. Like I was saying, submodels, they're very, very good when you get to things like your snowflakes. This is the Boscoyo 47-inch 3-prong snowflake. You come in here, this is a very nice looking model. Except when you click on it, the download right now does not have any submodels on it. You have to create those yourself. Some people will go in and they'll just create, well, let's see, what are these nodes here? And I'll highlight those. One comes down here. Now, when we're laying this out, it actually skips. It goes node 1, skips a hole, 2, skips a hole, goes 3, comes around all the little prongs and goes back. It does this rather than going in through every hole so that you don't have wires crossing from tip to tip when you're laying out the snowflake. James does a very good job laying these out. We've got nice node patterns in here right from the download, so you don't have to figure out how to wire it. You don't have to figure out how to draw this. It's all drawn out for you. However, not all of these are fully populated in submodels, and some of the submodels that are in there are not necessarily laid out how you'd want to do things. If I want to explode this particular model from the center, I need to know where these are in relation to each other, that it goes 1, 18 to 17, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 18. If I just want to spin this in a direction, just with the tips of the snowflake, then, and I want all these to be the same color, then I don't need that information. How much information you put into xLights is how much it can do on the submodels. The less you tell it to do, the less detailed you can get. The more you detailed it you get, the more effects that you can generate, and the more impressive your show will be. Like I said, up here, if I just tell it nodes 1 to 18 are going to be this particular thing, everything's going to light up, and I can light up this arm of the snowflake. This is what I'm calling in my submodel arm 1. It's just that arm. But if I do a detailed arm 1, I'm coming in and I'm coming down this. I'm telling it this is the first line of my snowflake. This is the second line. This is the third. And it's not 1, 2. It goes in the order that I showed you on the previous page. 1, 18, 2, 17. These basically become the rows in a submatrix, just like if you did it as a custom model. These are your different rows starting from the bottom to the top. You'll notice lines 7, 8, 9, and 10 have 3 of them on there. Why is that? That's because I've got these prongs that come out, and I wanted these aligned doing the same thing as if it was bursting from the inside out. The one thing xLights does not do that I am aware of is allow you to have a space in here so that you can line up the center nodes with this. Basically, this first line is going to have 1 column, second line is going to have a column, all these first 6 are going to have 1 column. These first numbers in your next column are going to align with these, and then it's going to create 3 columns for these lower matrices. Sometimes that can be a problem depending on what you're trying to do. If you want, you can get more detailed and create just individuals for all of those. Or maybe at some point there will be a way to put like a 0 or a space in there so that you can align things a little bit better. I'll try to show how that's a little bit useful with things, but right now it's not doable, but there's plenty you can do with it, so it shouldn't really hold you back. You can take submodels or models and you can put them into groups. These are just groups in there. I've created 2 different groups in here for the snowflakes, arms 1 through 6 with just the regular arms. That's 1 through 18, no order, and the detailed arms 1 through 6. These have it a little bit more detailed, so when I'm putting effects on there, you'll see what they do. The order is important. If you generate an effect by a per model or per submodel basis, it's going to generate on the order here. I'll show you a little bit how that's done on a matrix, but it applies to any type of submodel. If you do 1, 3, 5 for your order, 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 6, that's the order it's going to spin around your flakes or your arms, your snowflake when it generates them. Order is very important with anything we do. I also created a submodel on this particular snowflake called rings, where I'm bursting from the inside out. Again, line 1, this is going to be my inner ring here, highlighted up. I included all the nodes that would be on here to come around here. Line 2, next version out. You'll see line 1 has got a lot more nodes in here because it's got all of these particular ones in between. As we get out here, it gets less for a few of them. Jump out to 7, and I'm including all the little fancy prongs on the end of it again. It allows me to go from the inside out to give a nice type of starburst for doing that rather than having to use per preview. When you're generating this, a lot of people will put everything just on one line for rings. That doesn't do you any good for bursting from the inside out. Some people will make individual ring models. Rings 1, up here for a name, ring 1 all the way to ring 10, and then group them in a group that you can do that. It's perfectly fine to do that way. There's no reason you can't. It's also not necessarily needed. You can do that with submodels. Line 1 is basically your bottom line, your bottom row of your matrix. Line 2 is your next row. As you're spinning through these or putting an effect on it, if you do an up-down effect, it's just going to go through these as is. A right-left is going to go across your columns for spinning it around. Like I said at the beginning, there's many ways of doing the same thing. It's just what you're most comfortable with. So again, let's go back to xLights and see how this works. Jump back to our layout screen here. I'm actually going to skip over the circles in the wreath. If anybody's got questions on that at any time, my name's on the presentation. You have this, you can play around with it. What I'm going to show you first is a P10 panel for trying to show you what I'm doing with submodels. This is just a pure P10 panel that I made that would be a 3 across by 2 high P10 panel. And what I've created was submodels on here, panels 1 through 6. This being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can't really see them on that, but if I were to drop it down into my submodels here, panel 1 is that lower corner. This is using the soft buffer rather than node ranges, so I know I'm going to get these perfect. Panel 1, panel 2. I just did it like this to try to show you how the order is important. I also created down here, these are ghost models for this. These are using the exact same node layouts that are up here. It's just trying to break it out so that you can see the gaps between it. And then what I've done is I've created a couple of groups on here that have panels 1 through 6 based on the submodels on here. So you can see the little submarine. These are all submodels from that. Group them back together for generating effects. Over here, these are using my ghost models, putting those back together. This time in an order that's 1 through 6, numerical order. This group goes in the same thing. It looks like it's 1 through 6, but if you look down here, it's 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 6. If you went up to this one here, this is numerical order. So they don't necessarily show up in your drop downs here in the order that they are down here. So this is where you need to pay attention. You use these arrows here to adjust them up and down. So if I go over here, jump into my P10 portion, let me minimize this. Panel group. If I put a butterfly effect on my P10 panel, looks like a typical butterfly effect. These ones here are just the portions that I have broken down. They're just portions of this matrix, just mirrored over here using the same channels so you can see what's happening down there. If I were to put it in a panel group, this is my panel group made up of these. You'll see there's a little bit of change in the intensity of light, but the pattern is the same. I don't know why there's a change in intensity. I think it has something to do with the way it renders, but that's really not all that important. If I wanted to put something on individual panels, I can just come in here and I can put the butterfly on each of these panels. Whether this be on a submodel of that particular panel or one of my ghost models here, it's doing the same type of thing. This is panel 1. This was a submodel in here. I put it on the different ones. What you can really see better is where I've numbered them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all doing the same thing. Red background and the numbering is on there so you can see what's going on. My ghost models get the exact same thing. If I copy the effect from up here to down here, whether I'm putting it on a submodel up here or a ghost model down here, it's the same thing that happens. If I put a butterfly effect on each individual ones, it's the same that I was doing up here. Everything looks just the same as it is. However, when I get into starting to group subpanels together, you'll notice that things don't quite look good. And that is because when you're putting several different panels separate like this, now you wouldn't actually have panels like this. These might be individual matrices in different windows of your house. You're running it across the whole house effect. It's seeing the gaps between here and taking that into account. So when you're generating it on your entire house, it looks good on the whole house. When you combine it back into a panel, it puts a little bit of a line in here. You can see how things aren't aligning very well. You can see that even more here where I'm doing a nice little triangular wave. Looks great down here. Everything's where it should be. Up here, doesn't look like so good. There's gaps all over the place on there. Sometimes this is good if you're trying to generate it on the whole house. Sometimes you've got two panels that are separated by a walkway or something like that where you don't want it. That's where you can't use the default render style and you need to go to something a little bit different. You come up to here. If I were to put that same effect that was here on my ghost models that are basically these 6 panels grouped together, and I put on my panel group, this is what it should look like as opposed to this where it's kind of broken up. Same thing if I put it on my P10 panel, there's a little bit of change in resolution, but nothing too bad. But if I want to get this and make it look like this, I can't use my default render style. I need to go into here and I need to change that into a horizontal stack or a vertical stack or something along those lines that'll do it a little bit better. The problem that you run into when you're playing around with some of these is that when you're doing multiple panels that are both horizontal and vertical, it may not work perfectly. You may need to do it in one direction and then in another direction and break it down into additional panels. That's why you're seeing 2 different effects on here. It stacked all of these horizontally so they're all next to each other thinking it's one big panel, not thinking it's a rectangular panel that's on here. Vertical stack is putting them all on top of each other. You really can't see it here because it's not doing it. But as you play around with these different render styles, you'll do it. But none of these are the default render style where it's generating on the group, leaving these gaps accounted for up here. When you get into something like a curtain effect and you have it on a ghost model or any model that's in order, a group of submodels in order, it's generating this across from one side to the other. That's because it's a default render style. If you go into a horizontal per model where it's doing it based on the order of the panels that I put into that submodel. In this case, the first one here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're seeing them turn off. If I go to the other model where I had it 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 6, that's the way you're seeing the lights turn on and off. Again, order is very important when you're creating submodels. I know that one was probably a bit confusing, but it kind of builds up to a little bit more here. So we're going to get into submodels on this particular one, and this goes more along with the PowerPoint slides that I had. This is the center little square that I was showing you. If I do a trial 0 on a sub buffer, all my little white dots are lit up, and this is exactly what I want my sub buffer to look like. If I go to trial 1 on here, all these dots are lined up the same, but as I showed you, it's only one line. That's not going to be good if I want to generate something like text on here. If I go to trial 2, I've generated more little nodes. It tells me that I've got the right lines lit up based on the nodes that I put in here, but it doesn't show me that I have the order wrong. I can click on here to see that this is 121, hover over it to see that this is 140, go to the next one, 141 is actually over here, not over here. That would be an indication that my model is incorrect, but just clicking on to see what lights are lit up, you don't really know what that is. Trial 3, that's where I got it right. Again, that's going back to the PowerPoint. You can go back in the video and see that if you wanted to. I've also put a couple others in here. The vertical test, this was just to show that if I put something here, line 1 at the bottom, and I run an up effect from the bottom up, this is going to do what I think it is. And then I also put a spin one in here. This is a model. It's all one line, so it's going to be a single line model, but it's spinning around this here. Basically going every other row and column in the matrix. That's how you generate some of the funky effects that people are seeing, is you create some of these submodels in there to do it. This model down here is just a ghost model of my trial 1 that basically is going node 121 to node 280, I think it is, in the correct order, but it's only got the one row, so it's not quite what we wanted. This is trial 2, where it was working in the correct number of rows, but everything was starting on the left. The one down here is zigzag, so that's modeling what we really want it to be. Again, trying to show you several different ways of what's right, what's wrong, so that hopefully you'll understand a little bit more what's going on. Going to change this over to my submodels, and you'll see if I select the matrix with submodels, one color, the whole thing lights up. If I select it with any of the trial submodels that I did, red is on the full matrix, white is just on the submodels. Any of these look exactly the same. If I'm just doing colors and I want to get this type of bar effect, not bar effect, but stripe type effect on here, it didn't matter which of these trials I used to try to get things. It's all giving me very similar results. All of these submodels that are mimicking what's in here give the exact same thing. Looks good. Great if you just want to use an on effect. If you want to do something a little bit more, like a bars effect, you'll see that things aren't working quite the way I want it to be. This is a bars effect that should be sweeping to the right with 4 different colors. On this line here that's mimicking what I actually put in xLight, it looks great, but on my submodel, this isn't what I'm looking at. It's going up, it's kind of jumpy, it's nothing like I wanted it to be. That's because I used the wrong model. I didn't mimic exactly what xLights would be seeing. Here, I'm going into the next one. Working perfectly over here on my second model, but up here they're going crisscross. Why? Because I didn't zigzag that model. I go over here, now this model here, lining up perfectly with this is exactly what we want it to be doing, because I defined my submodel properly for that. It's giving me the results I'm looking for. If you don't define your submodels properly, you're not going to get the results you're looking for. It's going to confuse you. It's going to frustrate you. Pay attention to how you're defining those. It's really, really important that you do that. That's where a lot of people get confused. They don't know how to define a submodel. The number of lines in there are your number of rows. All of anything on one line is your number of columns for that. When I jump over here to text, I put this text on my trial one, which was just a single line. You'll see it's coming over. I'm moving it to the left. It should say ho, ho, ho. You can't decipher what that is. It comes in, but it's spinning all over on my matrix. Again, these down here are just ghost matrices trying to show you. It's running the text along here, but it's got no height, so it can't do anything. Here it's spinning from side to side because it's not sure what to do because it just sees that as that. Second trial gets a little bit closer. You can kind of make out some words on here, but you can see they're going in different directions. It's the third model where I defined it properly that it works perfectly. Now, for these here, I could have all just put these right on my trial 0 subbuffer where I used it. Again, I'm trying to use this as an educational tool to show you what to do when you don't have something that's perfectly laid out like that. And I'll get to that with my last model to show you how you can put text on something that isn't necessarily a nice rectangular thing. I'm going to jump back here real quick. If you remember my vertical test submodel showing that it goes up from the bottom, this is an up on a default, and you can see that my things are going in the up direction. That just proves that my line 1 is my bottom row, my line, whatever, I think 20 was my top row on this to prove that it actually works. And the spin effect that I was talking about, don't look at the house preview, just look at this. This is a nice way to get a nice little spin when you have edges. You really can't do that with too many other things and make it look good. That's where your power of submodels comes in on this. I'm gonna go jump over here, go into my submodels, or I'm sorry, my custom models with the snowflakes. 2 different snowflakes downloaded from the from Boscoyo. 2 slightly different things, and you'll notice when you look at these, they're 2 different sizes. This is a 24, this is a 47. This one here is laid out so that your arms, 2 of your arms are essentially horizontal. This one has 2 of your arms vertical. Which way are you going to hang these? You might want to hang them all with the arms in the same direction, so this one would be rotated a little, or have this one rotated the other way. You can rotate these just like you can anything else, but as I said before, xLights always considers this little dot here the top of your model. So if you put it on a default when it's rotated in this direction and go a right to left effect, or left to right, it's going to go from this side, it's going to scroll along here. It's not seeing this as being your top. Even if you have this rotated so that it's kind of like this, it's not seeing that point. That's where you need to either use your per preview render model, or you need to create submodels that are going to do what you want to do with it. All these dots over here are basically just points that are mimicking some of the submodels that I have put in here. I'll go into this one here. I made arms on here. These arms follow, and let me see if I can hover. This is node 8 here, node 2, node 7. Basically, I'm going from the inside out for each of my arms, going around the spinner so that I could control that. I did that so I could get a nice burst coming out from the center, or spin around if I wanted to. The problem with that is you'll see that on here, these 2 nodes theoretically line up in the same position, but they're going to be in different columns. So they're not going to light up at the exact same time the way I have this with 6 different arms. If I want to get a true burst from the outside, I created another with the center out that basically puts each of the sections from the center out as a different section. Again, I just did this at the submodel level and created that. You could do 1 ring on a submodel, the next line on a different submodel. You'd have 6 submodels and then put them together in a group. It's another way of doing it, but it gets you the exact same result. These over here are just taking that information because you can't see, let me go back to this. You click on your node layout, it's going to lay it out on here, but it will not show submodels. Another thing, since I have this open, you'll see that these, even though they are near horizontal, the two sides don't line up with one another. If I go into my per preview and I run an effect from the bottom up, these are going to light up before these light up. That's not what a lot of people want. A lot of people are super anal about things like that. If you want it to line up, you have to make sure that they're in the same position or that you create a submodel that's going to do that for you. Jumping over to here, like I was saying, this is based on the submodel data. It's just taking the points that I put into the submodels and creating that in rows and columns based on the submodel so I can view what was going on. Same thing over here. This goes with this one for, this is taking into account not all of the points. This one is taking into account only the arms. This one has all the points. This is more detailed. As I was showing in the PowerPoint, I've got the rings going from the inside. I've got the arms just in a pure numerical order for all the arms. And then I've got the detailed arms where I have multiple rows going from the inside out. Back into the sequencer. Again, right-click to change if you want to change the layers and see the different things. Click on my snowflakes. You can see here, this is a bars effect going on a snowflake from right to left. Probably not something you typically want to do on a snowflake. Not really good looking. You do it up and down, still not good looking. It's on the default model, so it's just taking it as the grid, running it across there. If you look closely at this, you'll see that this arm is always lighting up slightly before this arm. Again, not something you want to do. You can try rotating it a little, doing it at per preview. It's going to fix that a little bit, but it's never going to be perfect based on that. Typically what I might want to see is something like a snowflake exploding like this. I can use a shock wave. I can start messing around with some of my center positions, the radius that are on here and that, get something that looks pretty decent. But I created submodels. So I can go in there and I can go from the inside out, and these are going to be perfectly aligned exactly how I want it. This isn't quite the shock wave because I got multiple colors, but if I get rid of a couple of those colors and do black and white, it's going to kind of look like the shock wave. I'm actually going up. If I went down, wow, you can mess around with that. You can get things how you would want it exactly with that. It gives you many more options when you're using submodels on there. If I go with the center out and I change that right to left, remember, these are not necessarily in numerical order, so it's not making a lot of sense. Over here, if you look at the model I generated going from right to left, looks really neat over here. Perfect example of how this is what xLights is seeing and this is how it's generating it, but it doesn't mean anything to my snowflake model. It's more or less garbage because I put things in very incorrectly for that. If I want to spin around the arms, I need to come up here to my arms layout where I put those all in a group. That's what this model over here is, going up and down, spinning around these very nicely. That's what I want to do with it. If I go over here and try doing that from right to left, again, this looks good over here, looks pretty decent over here for the most part. It's going from the inside out. The problem is these two aren't aligning because those are in the same row on my grid. So or in different columns on my grid, so they're not going to go at the same time. You need to be more detailed with your models if you want it to get to have those at the same time, or use a different submodel like this one, where it was going perfectly with those two lighting up at the same time. This is the same thing, just on the 47-incher. You'll come in here, you'll see right, left, up and down, doesn't mean a lot. Starburst, or shockwave, I think it's called, goes from the inside out. Looks pretty good with that, but you got to do a lot of messing around with your radius and the other effects in here to get that. You can do the same thing with a submodel, generating it on there with a simple bars effect, doing it on that. I like doing that. It gives me more control. It gives me more color options. I can come in here and I can do a lot of different things with it timing-wise. Again, I did this purely at a submodel level. If you were to come over here, I have also... I've created a group where you can do the same thing at a group model. I just have to see which one that is. This one over here, this is a group of the snowflake detailed coming in and out. You can do it at the group model, of all your arms put into the same thing, or like I said, you can do it at your submodel by using rings. Two different ways of doing the exact same thing. You just have to make sure you put all your information in properly to get out what you want it. There's a bunch of different ones in here that you can kind of mess around with on your own. I realize I'm going quite a bit long here, so you'll see as you generate these in different directions, some of these here look really nice with my matrix that is mimicking my submatrix, but they don't look good on this. That's why you have to pay attention, the order that you're going. These are all up and down for the different arms. Makes a nice spinning effect in this direction. But going back to this direction, left and right, really doesn't mean anything to these arms. Order is very important when you're doing things in your rows and columns. Last thing I'm going to get to is just a final custom model that kind of pulls everything together that I've been talking about. This is the Santa Hat Matrix, direct download from Boscoyo. Really nice looking prop, really nicely laid out. If you click on your node layout, they've got it laid out very well for you with everything on here. It's a very big layout, so it's tough to fit it all on a screen. You can't really see too much of what's going on here. But when you go into here, you can see there's a little spinner for the ball on the hat. There's a matrix that would be on here, so you can run text and a couple of different things. There's a nice wiring layout. If you click on the wiring view to see how things go, that's in the reverse. You right click, you go to the front view, so it would match that. If you were to zoom in on some of this or make it larger on your own, you can see that some of these, when they start numbering, comes around the hat this way, comes in here, this comes down, 31 through 36 comes over, then it goes 37, and then it jumps up and back for several of these. Then it actually skips this node over here, comes around and back. When it does all of that, it makes this really confusing for submodeling. You have to pay very close attention to it if you want it to work right. Same with down here when you get into the matrix. The way it goes back and forth, you have to make sure you account for that back and forth nature of the zigzagging. That's why I was explaining it before. You got to pay attention to that. If you download this directly from the xLights download over here and put in this model, you'll see that there's just these first 4 submodels. The first one that you have is a matrix, and it's got 140 to 307. It highlights it perfectly. It looks like it's going to be a great matrix, but remember what I said before. This is only creating one row that's going to be this number of nodes long, and you can't put text onto a single line, which is what this is creating. It's not going to work for you. You need to create a different submatrix for that to be able to model it perfectly. What this is going to be good for is turning on all of these lights at the same color at the same time, or kind of going up and down. It's not really going to be good for a matrix the way it's laid out on there right now. Matrix outline looks kind of good for the most part. Things are lit up right. We've got nodes 1 through 7 over here lit up right. Then it goes to 113 to 139, which you think would be here, but that's 308. If I want to do something that's spinning around here, and it goes from node 7 to node 113, which is over here, and then down, it's going to go up this side, it's going to jump down this side, then I think it spins over here and comes around this direction here. It's not laid out so it can do a nice spinning effect. Again, single line is probably appropriate for this, the columns, but the order is wrong here, so you don't want to use that in my opinion. You get to the spinner. This spinner, when you go back to what I was talking about earlier with spinners looking just like a matrix and that, a spinner you don't want to be a single line of nodes. All the proper nodes are lit up, but we've got a couple of problems. We don't have the correct number of rows in here to make it work. We don't have the correct number of columns because it's way too many columns. It's going to act like a single line. And we're also not taking into account that this one here might be 31 through 36, which is in order properly. But then when we're coming to some of these other ones, they're not in the right order. These nodes are not consecutive. They skip a hole and then they come back. This one here continues down here, and it's not going to work right. So if we try to put an effect on here, we're going to run into all sorts of problems. We want to create a matrix for this It's going to make our spinner behave like we want it to. The hat, that's pretty good because that comes along here, but we are doubling back here. This is 96, 91, 95. Personally, I like keeping those in order so I know what I'm doing, and I could have an effect that comes up here, wraps around here, then comes down to these few. You can break it up into even more if you want to. That's up to you, but I'm just trying to show you how you could use this model to make it even more effective for your displays. So like I said, with the matrix, the way it was defined on a single line isn't good. I want to come in here, and I want this to be my starting location, node 160, going over to 140, second row up, in that order. Next one's going to go in a consecutive order, 161 to 181, and it's just going to keep going along, zigzagging back and forth, ending up here. By doing this, it's creating 8 rows by 20 columns that's going to make a perfect matrix for us that we can put text on. We can do anything we want to make some really nice effects on that, make this much more useful than just the pure download as it was. Again, no offense to James, he's making some great things. He's doing the wiring layout. I don't expect him to come in and make submodels for everybody for their exact use. You have to do that on your own for some things. He doesn't know what you're going to use it for exactly either. The spinner gets a little more complicated. The spinner basically has 12 arms, which to me says you've got to have 12 lines on here. Each of these arms should have 6 nodes. Some of these, 36 to 31, work perfectly. The next one, 37, 42, 38, I'm just going in order. For my particular use, I always went from the inside node to the outside node so that when I light up this column, I'm going to be lighting up the center. When I light up the last column of it, I'd be lighting up the outside. This is going to make a matrix. A matrix is what a spinner uses, generates a great effect. Again, come in, I did a revised matrix outline. You'll notice that these are not in numerical order. They go 120, 139. This basically says all the numbers from 120 to 139, then a comma, then everything from 1 to 7. It's doing a nice spin. I decided to start in the bottom left because that's where I wanted to. Submodels, you don't have to worry about where you're injecting or connecting your controller or doing anything like that. Did the same thing for the hat to add this on there. So where this all comes together is in the sequencer. Go to the final custom model here. The hat matrix. Here you can look at pretty much either of these screens. If I'm just using the ones that were in the download as it is, you can see it lights up the colors very nice, and it makes for some a pretty looking Santa hat. You can do that with either the models that were in there originally or the models that I put in there. Both will do it for you. But I'm going to show you the differences between a couple of what was in there and what I've tried to teach you to do on this. This is just a morph effect running along the Santa hat. You can't see too much of a difference between this one and this one that I've done because the only difference was a little bit of order here. You can see here, there's a little bit of back and forth that goes on in there. On this one, it only goes in one direction. Not too big of a deal. The matrix is where it really matters. If I put a ho-ho-ho across the matrix using the model that was in there right now, it's coming up with a bunch of dots. Again, it was a single row on there, it had no height, your text isn't going to look good. When I made a matrix and put it on there as a submodel with the correct row orientation, number of rows, number of columns, you can read that no problem. Come over here to a bars effect, just black and white, kind of a chase effect, spinning around it. You can see something comes up here, then there's a gap, and then it comes around. That's not what most people are looking to do when you're trying to spin something around it. Same exact effect on a different submodel, gives you a nice smooth chase around it. Not saying you have to do something like this, but you could. Same with the spinner. If you remember the bars from the earlier thing, spinning around nice and smooth. It kind of has some spinning on here, but you'll notice there's a lot of lights that are lighting up that aren't really perfect. Those of us that are super anal about their shows, that are most of us, this would drive us crazy. You might be able to change this to per preview and put a spinning type effect on here. But when you're trying to draw this out and it's in a model, The per preview, these lines are not going to line up perfectly, so it's not always going to work perfectly. If you use the submodel, like I have in there, nice smooth effect spinning around, does exactly what I'd want it to on there without having to do anything too crazy. You put it in there, you put a bars effect on there. You could have it bursting too instead of spinning. Either one works really well. So basically putting all that together, I put this together that kind of shows all of those in one. Here's something a little bit different. This one was a little bit crazy. It's got, in my opinion, a little bit too much going on. This kind of tones it back a little where I'm getting some spinning and all works together nicely. So that was probably a lot more than any of you wanted to hear about this, but hopefully it answered a lot of questions for you that maybe you didn't ask, but now you understand a little bit more, or I have totally confused you on what's going on. But in closing, the basic things you need to know is xLights sees models, submodels, and even groups as matrices. It can display them in many, many different ways, be it trees, circles, custom models, anything like that. But internally, it's just looking at a matrix. It's a rows and columns. That's all it is. So when you're planning on doing things, especially submodels, think ahead to what you want to do. You don't want to spend a lot of time creating submodels if you're just going to put a little spinning effect on there or lighting them up different colors. The Santa hat's a perfect example. If you're not going to use that matrix and you just want to light things up different colors, there's no need to create all those submodels. But if you want to put the text and all that on there, you want to create those submodels. The more detailed you want to be with your effects, the more submodels that you can use for that. And again, there's many ways to do the same thing. Use whatever you understand the best to do it. Combine all the different types for more possibilities. You don't have to just use the default render method. You can combine that with the default, the per preview. You can combine the same effect with a different rendering style, add the layers together, combine them all, and you'll get some great effects. You'll get some terrible effects too. Pick what you like, get rid of the rest. It's all a hobby and supposed to be fun for learning things like that. Also, don't expect a downloaded or shared model or effects to be perfect for your display. It depends on how you set up your models, your submodels, your groups. If you did it a little bit differently, like I said, if you put that green dot on the right-hand side, something that you downloaded is going to look very different on your display than it did on somebody else's. It may be good, it may be bad. There's no way of telling without seeing it, but don't expect it to be perfect if you're just downloading it and not paying attention. Again, a lot of people ask, a video of this presentation will be uploaded to videos.xlight.org within a few weeks. All of the effects that I showed on here are in that xLights file that I put on the shared Google Drive. Feel free to download it. If you have questions on it, I'm happy to answer any of those for you anytime. My name's in there. I'm on all of the forums as my last name or on Facebook, so you can just hit me up that way. And as always, don't forget to donate. The guys that have developed this program have done an excellent job. Not only are we trying to give back a little bit to them for their time, but it also takes money to keep things running. The Zoom session, the website, the downloads, everything that we do, it does cost money to donate or to keep operating. So even a few dollars, if you can donate, always does help everybody out. If you can't afford to donate or just don't like giving up money for doing that, donate some of your time, help a few other people out, answer some questions, volunteer to do one of these presentations for people. It's all very much appreciated and helps the developers not have to do that type of stuff. So that was all I had, which ended up going a lot longer than I thought it would. I apologize for that, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I'll just open up the floor to that.
So no apologies whatsoever from me. I really great material. You spent a great amount of time putting this presentation together, and I really, really do appreciate it. The floor is open for any questions. If you want to unmute yourself and ask, please feel free.
I have a question for people that share sequences or sell sequences that do this. There's not really a way I guess what I'm trying to ask, what's the easiest way for the person receiving the sequence to ensure they have the same submodels?
I would say communication is about the only thing that you could do, or if you have a custom model, I would say export that custom model with, and like include it with the sequence that you're selling or sharing.
Okay.
A README file.
Right.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The other part of this question is, when you have these submodels, let's say you create verts and horizontals on a window frame, but later the number of nodes changes, you have to physically go back in and touch up the submodels, correct?
Correct. Yes. If you change your node numbering or node layout, your submodels do not correct automatically. You have to do that manually.
Thank you.
But that's where, like, if you're sharing a sequence and you have a certain model layout that has a certain number of nodes in your submodels, and that's where somebody, if they have their own sequence, needs to go in and kind of adjust the submodels to what they actually have. They might have a slightly different star than you have. You can use the same effect on pretty much any type of spinner or star just by adjusting how many nodes are in that particular star, looking at your model versus their own model.
Yeah, that makes sense. I try to be generic with that, in the fear that if they are mapping their sequence from something of mine and the models are different, so will be the submodels, and there will not be a match.
Correct.
Well, I really liked your description of that. I came in a little bit late, coming in from an early dinner, but I picked up on some really cool stuff, so I can't wait to see the video when it's done.
Thank you.
So are there additional questions? One last time. Just feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
One thing I did see scrolling through the chat there, I did take something from Tom. I had asked him when I was putting this together to share one of his models with me, because he's got a nice 3D view of his house. And despite going as long as I did, this could have been even longer. So sorry, Tom, thank you for sharing, but sorry I didn't include that. But part of what I was going to share, I did talk about with xLights is not a 3D tool. It displays things with what looks 3D to you visually, but it is not 3D. So that's why when you're drawing your lines horizontally or vertically, or I recommend drawing them horizontally or vertically, not based on what you're looking at in a picture, because if you draw it slightly off horizontal, it might not all light up at the same time. And Tom's got a nice 3D view. If anybody's seen it one of these times, he's got a nice, I think it's a Google SketchUp rendering of a barn. That's a very nice 3D view perspective of it. And he's got a lot of good effects on there. But if you don't know what you're doing with something like that, you could really get yourself into a lot of trouble trying to just render on a default type model.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much. You spent a lot of time, extremely detailed and great information, and I truly want to thank you for everything you've done. I may ask you after the call, though. I know you skipped some material, and if you've got the time, we might want to add that back to the final video, because I learned everything on almost every slide that you had. So great. I want to remind everybody that next week the presentation will be Russell McFarland talking about security cameras and setting one up for your home. And then we're going to end this call. I'm going to end on Facebook Live now and end the recording. So the floor is open for any Christmas-related questions. Don't everybody jump at once. I have a question or two. I don't know if there's anyone on the call. This is your first year. And I know sometimes some of the old veterans start talking and dominate the conversation, but I want to open the floor up to anybody that